Hey, this is Boaz. Thanks for showing up. Please visit the Fools and Sages podcast at foolsandsagespodcast.com. There are no spaces and it's all spelled out. You can find show notes, references, bios, merch, and other cool features. Contact us if you have feedback or a question, if you want to appear on the show, or if you want either or both of us to be a guest on your podcast. You can listen and subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, Rumble, Apple Podcasts, iHeart Podcasts, and anywhere else great podcasts are found. And follow us on X and Instagram. Support us on Patreon. The Patreon link's also in our website. And thank you. Enjoy the show. Good afternoon, Brian.
How are you doing?
I'm good. First snow of the season here in Santa Fe. There's about a foot of snow on the ground and still coming down.
Yeah, I came through, nearly knee-deep snow. The studio here is about a football field's length from my house, so I had to beating trees to get the snow off so the branches don't break and clear the path, and I started my little fire in there, so took the edge off.
Yeah.
But, yeah, it's a new white world all over the place. It's like the trees look like Dr. Seuss books.
Yeah.
But,
I remember one of the first times I came up to your place, there was a bunch of snow on the ground. And so the roads had disappeared. And there was no telling like which two trees I was supposed to drive between. It was like
mhm,
somebody came through finally, maybe Chuck or somebody came
okay,
through, and then I was able to follow them part of the way. But
yeah.
yeah, up on the mesa when it snows, it's like wilderness.
Well, and back in the day when we couldn't afford four-wheel drives because they were exotic vehicles, we got snow one time that the snow was thigh deep, and we were snowed in for at least a week, maybe going on 10 days, when this has only happened on 2 occasions in about 40 years.
I remember the other one.
Yeah, and I had a truck that didn't get stuck. I could technically move it, but it kept pushing such a big pile of snow with the grill that I'd get a, 5-foot bank of packed snow and I couldn't push it any further. I could always back up and I could drive back and forth. So I ended up going out with a backpack to get dog food, to get some propane probably, and we were walking along the road, and we lost the road completely and hit fence lines and did it all by fence lines, and then, made it down, hitchhiked to Santa Fe, hitchhiked back, and then, did the 4-mile walk through. The road part was easy, but the last 2 miles with that was a challenge, but I was young and strong,
Yeah.
so
Post holing you feel the next day in all kinds of surprising places. One that always surprises me, because I've done a lot of post holing in the mountains here, and where Jody and I would get into snow that we weren't expecting, and your shins hurt because every time you post hole, the front of your leg
uh-huh.
hits the bank of snow in front of it, and you wouldn't think with layers on that that's gonna
Yep.
leave a mark, but I was bruised for weeks.
Yeah, and I think that's how the wolves catch deer and elk.
Yeah,
When the snows that the wolves can run on the top and the hoofed animals still break through, then it's
yeah,
like it's on. And,
yeah.
no, it's a whole thing, and, there is that question, are we snowed in or is everyone else snowed out?
I was gonna say that's how the rabbits get away from the wolves, though, in the winter, because they stay on top.
That, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, although I haven't seen we just had this dump overnight and it's still snowing out there. We're at over a foot now, and, I haven't seen the tracks of any animals.
Huh.
I did go out to sweep off the solar panels, but I knew this was gonna come, so I stashed firewood
Yeah.
and, so we're good, and I got my new roof on, so I don't have a single leak. It's, like, blowing my mind. But yeah,
So,
that's not the only thing blowing my mind, but
yeah, right.
everybody's blowing in my mind now.
That's a good segue. So it's November 7th as we record this, and we're 2 days after, I think, what was a historic election. And normally we don't talk about politics a whole lot, and we're not so concerned with who's on what side and that sort of thing.
Right.
But we've been talking for a long time about what the movements are in kind of the collective. And
Right.
in the United States, I think there's some really interesting dynamics.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, wondering what's top of mind for you.
Right. Well, since we did that wonderful show with Rich Rubino, shout out to Rich. You are a force of nature, my friend. Uh, it has had me thinking more about, not just the current events, but also about, here on Fools and Sages, we talk about philosophy, we talk about psychology, we talk about religion. And one of the things about those conversations is that they kind of bleed into each other because there are definitely psychological aspects to religion and psychological aspects to philosophy and philosophical aspects to, religion and philosophical aspects to psychology. I mean, these are all three mutually illuminating fields. And, politics is one of the things that kind of falls out of that because we're talking about human minds interacting, and we're talking about, if we think about philosophy as the love of wisdom, and if we think about wisdom in the simplest terms as how do we have good outcomes for ourselves and others given all the things we can't predict? Our political structures come out of a philosophy that this is a way that we actually can pursue a type of collective wisdom so that we're actually living better than, as Rich called it, quoting Rousseau and Hobbes and Locke, better than the state of nature. And, because as we experience today, we are still vulnerable to the states of nature. And as this snowstorm is abundantly proving. And so this idea that we're trying to find a way to work together for a better outcome is the philosophical underpinnings of polity, right? Which is this idea we get political from polity, and then polis, of course, is the Greek word for city.
What's polity?
Well, polity. I think Rich mentioned that within Aristotle's six forms of government, he considered polity the highest. And I'll have to research that to give you a real strict definition, or maybe we can ask Rich that on our upcoming show as the follow up show to this all. But this idea that we've come together, we have a city, which is basically the manifestation of that woven togetherness of the political body, what they call literally the body politic, right? Traditionally, and so yeah, how do we do that? That's what politics is all about. There's a bunch of different ways that people have explored, and in our last show with Rich, we explored the history of the American experiment in this. And, politics are always like a map of the psychology of the people that are made up of it. And there's some really interesting stuff to talk about, I think, about that.
Yeah, so what does this election tell us about the psychology of people in the United States right now?
Well, maybe we should have a general conversation before we get to that to lay a foundation for it. We had a conversation about interdependence. We did one of our episodes is about the transition from dependence to independence to interdependence. And in that context, we show it as as a transition from as a process of growth, if you will. And that tends to paint interdependence in its or structures of dependence in its positive evolutionary light. We talked about teamwork. We talked about how groups of people can achieve things together, both physically, which, your outward bound programs usually demonstrate that sort of thing, but also intellectually. There's a lot of science that shows that we think better together. But then there's this other side that, there's this old joke. Have you ever heard this about a guy's going along and there's another guy and he's standing up on the side of the bridge and he's about to jump off? And now this is usually told as a joke about religion, but I'm telling it to you as a joke about psychology.
Okay.
And the guy comes up to the fellow about to jump off the bridge and he says, "Brother, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? Life is not that bad. Let me talk to you." He says, "Surely, there's a way around this. Are you religious at all?" And the guy says, well, yes, I'm religious. He says, well, are you Protestant or are you Catholic? And he says, well, I'm Protestant. And the guy in the wrist says, oh, well, I'm Protestant too. You know, so we have that in common. And what denomination are you? And I've heard this joke using a variety of denominations. So not choosing anyone particularly. I think the one that sticks in my mind was Presbyterian. So for these purposes, we'll make him Presbyterian. He says, well, I'm Presbyterian. Well, I'm also Presbyterian. And then he says, are you the Reformed or the traditional form of the Presbyterian? He says, well, I'm the Reformed. He says, well, I'm also the Reformed. He says, now, are you from the Reformation of 1918 or the Reformation of 1933? And I don't know what these were. I'm just filling them in. And he said, well, I'm from the Reformation of 1918. So I pushed him off the bridge. And, that's told usually as a joke about religion, but really they're telling us something. The reason that we laugh about that is because we know that, like many jokes, it's pointing to something that's true, and it has to do with our relationship of us and others. Right? We talked about this in terms of no boundary in Ken Wilber's book, how the bigger associations and the smaller associations. So here, the very nature of sectarianism puts us in the competitive team mode rather than the helping out a team member mode. And that's what that joke is really about, right? We're on the same team. 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 Oh, you're on a different team. Push him off the bridge. And, what would a Martian see? A Martian would see somebody that just was perfectly reasonable, perfectly cooperative, perfectly well-meaning and compassionate, and then in an instant they just go insane, right? All of a sudden something has switched from same to other, another circuit has been triggered, and now they do an action that everybody can see clearly. This is a mal in se behavior. This isn't even just mal prohibido, right? If you from our previous episodes, we talked about that distinction. If you're not familiar with those, go back and get them.
Right. Well, just to clarify, so Malin say being something that we can all agree is bad.
That in Latin means evil or bad in itself.
Yeah.
And say, yeah.
And then the other is mal in pro,
The other is mal prohibido.
mal prohibido,
So
which
it's just
is
a
bad
prohibited.
in this situation, parking ticket kind of stuff.
Yeah, driving on the right side of the road and stuff that we're never going to think they're evil just because they did that kind of thing. So that's
Yeah.
the big bads and the little bads. The bads that by nature we through all time and all history have seen as bad, and the things that are just conventional that we agree. Now, and there's different schools of thought. Some say that there is no, believe it or not, that there is no absolute. And some say that it's all custom, it's all convention. This gets relevant later when we talk about postmodernism, right? But then there's there's a famous conversation between a guy named Dworkin, famous legal philosopher, and I'm trying to remember the guy that he had the argument with. It's something non-memorable like Smith. But anyway, you can search this. If you search Dworkin, I remember that because he sounds like one of the seven dwarfs. But that's why it's stuck in there. But there's this idea: is there a judge who judges absolute truth and correctness and what's just, or is it all just convention? And so anyway, that's an old conversation and a bit of a digression. But so how do we get here? Um, so we have this. Where the political undertaking is about how do we work these things out? How do we work together? But we have this psychological problem that of teams. And Jefferson said this. I think Washington said this. Like, look out for political parties. And I think there's some interesting mechanisms that we can go through that Rich alluded to in our last episode about the way the science of politicians understanding the public and the way they need to present things to the public to make the public's opinion the most useful to the politician's ends, and that there's a lot of science behind that, right? So So we kind of get into this question, a perennial question of what happens to us psychologically when we go into this experience. And it's tied up with our identity. We know identity is tied up with our fears and our desires. We've talked about that already.
And our bewilderment.
Yeah, and I think we see extremity on both sides. So we can get an idea that maybe there's this idea that we hope that in difficult times, that old saying, may calmer minds prevail. Right. So there is this idea that, we maybe experience some psychological aberrations when we're under the influence of team psychology, that something about our competitive nature maybe triggers us back to our primordial primate psychology, and the other becomes, and there's plenty of evidence of this, they're not human,
Mhm.
right? Do you remember I told you about the remembering that my clan was apparently involved in the Battle of Clontarf, and when they caught the guy that killed the king of the High King of England, Brian Boru, they didn't just kill him; they tied his intestines to a tree and made him walk around the tree. Right? So humans, and this is why I say, under the influence of team, we reach this extremity really quickly. And, there's some famous quotes about how long it takes to build up civilization and how it can be lost in moments, right? So, those oldsters like me, we remember the My Lai massacre. Now, war is a special case of this, but psychologically, I think we're talking about the same thing. And, Wilhelm Reich wrote an entire book called The Mass Psychology of Fascism. And I suspected we might talk about this, and I wanted to do a little more, research to brush up my memory from. I haven't read it for years and years, but I think we do know that there is a psychological shift that can happen, and that maybe it doesn't always serve us, but it feels so righteous and it feels so good, and all of the things that all of our frustrations and everything negative can be put into the other. In Santa Fe, we have this tradition called zozobra, and that goes back to the 50s. And we create this big creature, and this man they call Mr. Gloom, right? And we put all of our negativity, all that otherness, all that stuff that's in the way, and we're supposed to burn it up, right? Now, if we're wise, we realize in that burning, now it's not free floating for us to just slap on people who might be our neighbors. They might even be our family members, right? But somehow that otherness gets a hold of us. We're going to slap that otherness thing on there. And then this other psychology is free to take place, right? And then we have these times when that breaks through, where we break through that. These times that, I just heard a wonderful story about a guy who was flying a fighter plane and he's limping back, and the German fighter pilot can shoot him down, but they see each other. They have an eye to eye moment. For some reason, the team thing breaks and he lets him go. Then they meet in their 80s and become great friends, right? Because somehow that psychology shifted, right? Well, this is all in the semantic world, right? I mean, if you're in the street and someone's physically attacking you, yes, it's not in the semantic world. But as soon as we get into the team thing and we step out of the actual moment of conflict, some other thing takes over, right? That's all semantic world implications. And that's where we can solve this stuff, right? So I see people that are now very, very unhappy, and they indulge that extremity as if that's a solution to the situation that maybe, and this is why I want to talk to Rich, maybe it was that extremity that was a part of the formula that caused this for them. Anyway, uh, that's what's been going on in my head around this, um, psychophilosophically.
One thing I'm noticing, at least in my bubble, in the reactions that I'm seeing, is not understanding how this happened or misdiagnosing why this happened. So I'm seeing like a lot of, well, I guess the white supremacists won. or I guess there are more white supremacists than we thought, or I guess women don't really want to vote for their own interests, or and all of those seem to me to be really missing at least what I think happened, and maybe it's useful for me to share a little of what I think happened.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Give it a foundation. Do that for us.
I think there are a lot of factors here. I saw an article this morning by Neil Ferguson in the Free Press, and I only had time to read the first couple of paragraphs, but he basically says this was a a victory for kind of rational thinking about things like gender ideology and about kind of mainstreaming radicalism, and for the citizen journalists, and for the builders and makers, people like Elon Musk that want to create something. And that covers more of the topics than what shows up as most foundational for me, which is that the Democratic Party or the Democratic machine, working with mainstream media and big tech to create and control a narrative, became transparent. It became transparent through things like CBS moderators fact checking Trump but not Harris, and editing the interview they did with Kamala. And then when there was this whole thing happening where if you tried to Google the Trump assassination attempt, nothing came up. And there were all these like death by a thousand cuts kind of things where I was like, it's you get enough of these examples. It sure seems like there's a collusion going on, and about Joe Biden being incapacitated mentally, where the mainstream take on that was it's just not happening, right? That gaslighting. And then
Right.
coupled with the mainstream media saying things like the New York Times had a headline a few couple of months ago about whether the Constitution was an obstacle
I know. I saw that.
to American success. I don't remember exactly what the
It's
phrase was.
definitely an obstacle to some things, and that's why it was written the way that it was
Yeah,
written,
but all
absolutely.
of those kind of adding up, I think made it really evident to a lot of people that there's a game going on here.
Yeah,
And and that to me seems so much more a factor in how America voted than white supremacy
yeah,
or women voting against their interests or all of these like
yep,
really one-dimensional interpretations. And
right.
I can understand that in some sense, but I guess I kind of don't know what to do with that because I don't see it as we have two competing worldviews, right? At least not. What I mean by that is two competing worldviews would both be filled in to some extent and address a range of topics related to the success of
Yep,
civilization.
yep.
And I'm not seeing that. And ironically, I don't think Trump has a particularly compelling vision for human success. But right away saying we're gonna stop gender mutilation on kids, and we're gonna get our hostages back from Gaza, and we're gonna like get some basic shit done here.
And stop taxing tips.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm
Yeah,
kind of I don't know how to make sense of these like one-dimensional interpretations, and
right.
how do we break that othering?
I see it through a couple different windows. Like, if I take the who's right and who's wrong conversation out of it, and I don't look at it culturally, and I just look at it strategically or what is the psychological dynamic here? There was a great little video that I saw. I think I might have even mentioned it before of it clearly coming from a third world country, maybe somewhere in the Middle East. And the guy's been demoing out a building with a sledgehammer. Did I mention this to you before? Does that ring a bell? He's demoing it with a sledgehammer. It's really hard work. And then his boss shows up and he's got this new, like pneumatic or electric powered jackhammery kind of deal that he can use on this wall. And the guy's so happy, and the guy gives him this new tool and he's got a smile and they kind of poses with it for a minute. And then he takes it over to where he's been working and he starts swinging the thing against the wall and just doing exactly what he was doing with the sledgehammer. But now he had this new tool that he didn't entirely grasp what powered it or how to apply it to the problems that he was applying the old tool to.
It reminds me of your reference to McLuhan about when radio is introduced to Africa, it's gonna cause revolution, not because of the what's said over the radio, but because the new media is unintegratable into an old mindset.
Yeah, and there's another saying that goes along with that, where they say that generals tend to fight the last war.
Hmm.
So if I was going to just purely try to analyze what went wrong here, they were applying last war technology in a new field, in a new scenario, a new what do they call that, theater in the strategy game. And there were fundamental differences in this theater. And the thing is, if we look at it like the arms race, right? The rule seems to be that no amount of the last chapter technology is good against the slightest amount of the new chapter technology. So, for example, the best plow horse you have is not going to plow as much field as maybe a mediocre but adequate tractor. Or, it goes all the way up. When the bow and arrows met the muskets, I mean, it was a contest there. The muskets were kind of slow, but as soon as they perfected it and you got the repeating rifle, then you had four guys standing off 200. No extra arrows were going to help that. And I did see on the left a kind of I guess it was more visceral than thought out, but just this impulse that said, like, if we just call him Hitler one more time, I think that's gonna do it.
Or get Beyonce to show up one more time, or like, I think that, I pulled up this Neil Ferguson quote because I didn't I covered it, but I didn't do it justice. The name of the article is "The Resurrection of Donald J. Trump," and the header says, "Trump's victory is a blow to political lawfare, critical race theory, woke campuses, legacy media, and Hollywood. It's also a win for a new generation of builders like Elon Musk."
Now see, all of that would have flown 15 or 20 years ago when all the media outlets had gatekeepers, like editors, to make sure that everything was hunky dory before it went out the door. And that's part of, and this is kind of my theory, is that the new technology really here is the internet. And particularly we saw it with Trump embracing a 3-hour interview with Joe Rogan and Kamala just not knowing, I can't go there. We're just going to spend I listened to an interview with one of the DNC leaders on the East Coast. He was complaining. He was very unhappy that they'd lost the race. And I said, "Well, what do you think? What was wrong?" And he said, "We just didn't have enough signs." He was talking about yard signs. Now that maybe would have been a sound conclusion in the 1980s. Maybe that was a real factor then. But now with the internet, I think that Trump's embracing media in a way, and the reliance of the Democrats on the old school media, I think what we're seeing is this paradigm shift, and that was a big part of it. And that's not even going into policy. I'm just
Yeah,
saying that
I
that
know you don't I know that there are a few layers to what you're saying, but I think that the media shift demonstrates how I think how Americans, or some segment of Americans, reacted to the gaslighting by turning to new media, and also identified the gaslighting by getting information from new media.
right.
But saying, well, 15 years ago, that would have been different, doesn't speak to the extent of the collusion that was happening.
Right, right, not at all.
Um, and and that's a really interesting dynamic because I mean, it strikes me as one of these like semi-conscious conspiracies where there are probably individuals saying we have to control misinformation, and so
Right.
we're going to, people in the government, and
Yep.
they're the FBI apparently having a direct line into Twitter and violating FOIA requirements by not preserving their interactions with Twitter more than 10 days, and things like that are like, okay, that's conscious conspiracy, I'll say. But then there's also a lot of unconscious conspiracy where there are just a lot of bureaucrats inserting their filters, consciously or unconsciously, into the process of developing information and transmitting information.
Yeah, and I think that some definite decisions were made. I listened to Ralph Nader, and he talks about this being the fruit of a tree that was basically planted in the 1970s. That the 1970s was where the Democrat Party started to abandon the the wage employees, and they want to break it down in different demographics, but I think that's the real thing. And what he said was that they abandoned half the country, and then in '79 they started taking corporate cash. And that when they started taking corporate cash, they started getting these commercial values. And that somewhere in there, they turned away from being New Deal Democrats into corporate Democrats. And when that happened, they started subcontracting their elections out to, what did he call them? He called them corporate conflicted profiteering consulting firms. They completely abandoned public media. They never learned from Hillary, and that every time they lost, they never fired anybody. That's basically what Ralph said about it.
Yeah, I dig that. Um, but the issues that the Democrats were putting front and center so much weren't corporate issues, like
No, no.
gender ideology and critical race theory and DEI and like that whole wave of stuff is really anti-corporate. And so
Well,
how did they
but
lose their
didn't the
way?
corporations just figure that out with, ESG, and
No,
didn't
they
their
weren't
Bud Light
driving that.
moment, wasn't that the high watermark, you think, of that?
Corporations weren't driving that to begin with, though. Corporations were kind of like figuring out how they were going to deal with DEI and ESG. I mean, I'm saying corporations really generically, but
Right.
the mass of corporations, including the ones that donate a lot of money, ESG, I think, is driven much more by the UN than corporations.
Oh, that's interesting, because I did see, I mean, it just showed up in places that you would never expect, like Tractor Supply?
But they're trying to get their ESG scores so they get access to different capital or access to different markets and things like that. They're
Right.
they're just trying to jump through that hoop, but they didn't create that hoop. John
Right,
Deere did
no,
not
no.
create the ESG hoop.
And I think that there's a big question nowadays, people are very interested in just exactly who did create that hoop.
Well, I think it's the UN. James Lindsay has a lot of content on this. I'd love to have
Oh,
him one
interesting.
day. He's a wild man, but he's you know diagnosed in great detail where ESG and DEI and all this stuff comes from, and it's an interesting read. Christopher Rufo also a little less academically, but it's not coming from business, and so for the Democratic Party to shift even from being the corporate Democrats to whatever this is,
Right,
and then colluding with Google and Facebook and the mainstream media, and then that becoming transparent to it seemed like everybody, but I guess
right.
52% of everybody. That's new material, I think.
Don't we have, like, new creatures in that landscape? These, like, mega corporations like BlackRock and,
Yeah.
State Street and, okay, the other one escapes me, but I know you're out
Vanguard,
there.
Vanguard.
Yeah, yeah, Vanguard, exactly.
Yeah.
And, And they don't seem to metabolize the same way a normal corporation does when we say corporation, what we're used
Right.
to,
Right.
like a brand name that we see on the front of a building. This is a beast of another nature, isn't it?
Yeah, and I'm not an expert on it, but I see that as really a player in the capital market more than a corporation. They're like upstream of corporations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering because it seems like that's where some of that money came from for, I mean, this incredible amount of money that was spent just on this last election.
I don't know where it came from.
Yeah.
I mean, it wouldn't surprise me, but my point is the reason this collusion seems like the most important factor to me in why this election went the way it did is that the issues seem to have become secondary on the Democratic side.
Or all symptomatic.
Yeah, maybe say more about that. I'm not sure what you mean.
Um, well, I mean, my feeling is that, and to me, when I see people attacking the Constitution, not that I'm a rabid constitutionalist, I just know why it exists, and I know why the Bill of Rights exists, and you will too, listeners, if you go back to our episode with Rich Rubino, because we talk about what came out of that, right? But it does feel like some of these large, powerful, influential interests are kind of wanting to change the way things work so they can get what they want easier. So, for example, I saw a thing they said here that Trump won with 18 to 25-year olds. And so that makes me think, and this was a question I want to give to Rich also, is Trump basically the anti-authoritarian candidate in the face of this collusive mega monoliths that we see?
I think that's it. Ironically, Trump ended up being the anti-authoritarian candidate, and I think that's such a stretch that I think a lot of America that's what happened, and I think a lot of America doesn't understand that, and I
And
don't know
why
how to.
being a 34-time felon actually helped those credentials rather than
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think it's more that the collusion became so transparent that it was almost not anything but Harris. Not let's elect anyone but Harris, but let's elect anyone who's not part of
that
gaslighting us.
the
Yeah.
what they're calling the blob.
Yeah, the blob, the deep state, the whatever. Yeah.
Mhm.
And Hollywood and legacy media and all that stuff. Like the number of Hollywood people I see on Twitter who are, I assume, inadvertently part of this collusion is pretty staggering. Like the very few people, and part of it is their age also. I mean, I think it is harder for somebody in their 70s or 80s to turn their to let's say to tune their meter to the array of factors that we're dealing with now compared
Mhm.
to 15, 20, 30 years ago. And so that's a factor too, and so,
Absolutely.
people like, Robert De Niro is a great actor, and I've always thought he's probably a great guy, but he just doesn't understand what just happened.
My mind was blown when I saw how Noam Chomsky fell for the whole, narrative push behind COVID. How, but what we're really seeing here, and this fits the model of the paradigm shift that we've kind of talked around, but that my reference to that is always Fritjof Capra in The Turning Point, where he talks about the implications of the quantum paradigm trickling through all the other fields. And what we're seeing is a real change in some of these institutions that have been like bulwarks for all of my lifetime. And you trust your doctor, you trust these big corporations. They couldn't say it if it wasn't true. You trust it's kind of where America was, right? And then it seemed like there's been this ongoing rude awakening, maybe from the days of Dick Nixon onward, to that maybe some of these institutions, and see, this is the thing, is that is the realization that postmodernism is built on, is that these old-fashioned institutions are too lethargic, they're too top heavy, they're too monolithic, they're too anti-people, and and none of that is necessarily wrong. It's the therefore that comes after it, and then we get into Chesterton's Gate, right? Like, what were the reasonable reasons that these things were built around? Like, and defunding the police is a great example of that. California passed Proposition 36 with a 70% margin.
Yeah, that is a great Chesterton's Gate. That's a perfect example. Like, why
Talk
why do we
about a
need these police anyway?
retrenchment.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, and maybe this is the human thing where we just keep learning the lessons over and over again because the cycle is just a little bigger than human remembrance. That's why the old way was you had the elders, but in a time of hyper novelty, there are no elders, right? We need to look for something else.
Oh, that's interesting. I think of the real role of elders as being extremely valuable in that scenario. And maybe even why doing something like the Fools and Sages podcast seems meritorious. Like, making sense is a relatively timeless thing. There
True.
has to be a stepping back, right? And getting out of being paradigmatic, in order to be a successful elder.
To translate from the specific to the general and then back to the new specific. Yeah.
Right, right.
Yeah. Yeah. And that really is the trick, but I think the other half is in the listening because in this context, why listen to elders? Right? Now I got some arguments for that as do you, but I think that that's a one of the things that we're facing now, and I would say it dovetails into this felt sense of lack of meaning. It's like, maybe there were some things in The Angle of Repose by Stegner. I just came across a part, and he said, "Youth is all about freedom, but in my old age, I've come to understand that freedom depends on order."
Oh, that's interesting. Wendell Berry has a great essay about that in Harper's years back, about Faustian
Okay.
economics and how constraints and limitations are a prerequisite to the creation of value. Sounds like a
Right.
similar. I love
Yeah.
that essay. Say
Yeah.
more.
Yeah. Chip off of the old block.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Um, well, and I think that the real thing is, and I've said this before, that I translate, and this is why I was asking Rich, does it really matter who wins? Because the theory that says that we're going through a collective transformation of some kind because of the larger story, whether it's the cyclic nature of things or whether it's the evolution of the human race and consciousness or whatever it is, the idea is that maybe we're going for the ride rather than driving. And I've mentioned that, the fleas on the dog might think that tugging on a hair here and there is driving the dog, but it just happened the dog was running in the direction that they were wanting it to go. And when the dog changes direction, all of a sudden that illusion that we're controlling things is broken. And the idea of self-organizing systems that reorganize just like a caterpillar reorganizes into a butterfly. And we don't, the the cells of the butterfly don't really get to vote, or the cells of the caterpillar don't really get to vote if they go through the transformation of the butterfly. They just get turned into goo with everything else. And so that's where that question comes from is, are we just reorganizing and we're going in and out of states of criticality as we do? I think there's probably a good argument to that. It's an old argument. It goes back to Nietzsche or before that even, right?
Yeah. And then free will has to get talked about too. Like, but maybe enough fleas pulling on enough hairs does something. Um, but before we go there, you said something a couple of minutes ago. Um, I've got like three other competing thoughts going on, so I don't know if I'll be able to fish it up. But I think it was about that, along the lines of us undergoing transformation and and transformation having a cyclical nature, and that made me think of the cycle that's been getting memed for the last few months about something like strong men. Uh,
Uh,
how does it go? Strong men create
make good times make
good
weak
times
men.
cause weak men cause bad times cause strong men.
Right.
So I'm thinking about, that cycle, but I'm curious what other cycles come up for you in terms of this transformation, and because honestly, I'm not relating it to something cyclical, although I'm sure if I look on a big enough scale, maybe I could find that. But I'm looking at this as like paradigm shift. Like
Right.
I, I
Sure. Yeah, yeah.
I don't think Trump is ultimately an important component of this paradigm shift. I think the
That's kind of my point. Yeah.
yeah, I think it's there are so many areas in which extremes have been realized, like the deficit and the debt and
Mhm.
maybe income inequality. I'm not sure if that's how extreme that is, and a myopia around economic growth as like the ultimate measure of success. And not that economic growth is not very important, because if we get some listeners commenting on that, uh, this is not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, but just like extremes and political extremes also. That
Sure.
this seems like a reaction to those extremes to bring some rationality back. And I guess the biggest extremes I experience are like ideological. Um,
Sure.
and this is kind of like, well, if the Department of Education has failed in so many aspects of public education, then why are we spending billions of dollars on it, right? And how can we do that better? And there was a tweet this morning where there was a screenshot of an Elon Musk tweet that I think happened shortly after he bought Twitter, and that tweet said, "What have you gotten done this week?" And the tweet with this screenshot said, 3 million government employees are about to get this tweet, and as they should, right? As we should. There's kind of a reckoning, I think.
Well, doesn't it go all the way back to Genesis?
Say more.
Well, when we were driven out of the Garden of Eden, part of the deal that came along with that is that that women will bear pain, have pain in childbearing, and that you shall live by the sweat of your brow. And God, there's so much interesting stuff packed into there. And I think we might have briefly talked about some of the Gnostic interpretations of that myth and the idea that the snake was actually Jesus, that was waking people up to the knowledge of good and evil, and that that the serpent didn't actually become a manifestation or interpreted as a manifestation of Satan until way later in the story. And then, of course, the snake being associated with Kundalini and Kundalini awakening, bringing awareness of higher aspects. So there's just all kinds of interesting stuff in there. But the idea that living by the sweat of your brow, having to go through it. I mean, this is a big topic for me, right? Because I really think that we don't, we don't do ourselves a service by trying to escape those more material aspects of our reality. Like I think that we do need to come to terms with our ass, for it bears us, that we are part of why we're here is part of that. And so uh the impulse to try to escape that all the time, I think we should probably investigate that, explore it a little bit, and understand that our materiality brings us something. We talked about suffering bringing something. Well, the fundamental foundation of Buddhism is called the Four Noble Truths. The first noble truth is called the recognition of suffering. That if you have a body, if you are incarnate in the here and now, you will experience suffering. Uh, and then it goes on, and we've talked about how a lot of that suffering can go on in the semantic world, and the Buddhists say, well, what is the second noble truth is the recognition that the suffering is associated with this self that we've created, and with association with the self that exists in the semantic world, and the self that dies, that can fear death in the semantic world. And then the third noble truth is about how altering that relationship and the nature of that self and how that self relates to reality and to its self, ironically, is the key to transcending that suffering. Not escaping it, transcending it. And then the fourth noble truth is the Eightfold Path, which we've spoken about before on the show. And that's the right view, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right occupation, and right intention. And that's kind of like the formula to how to alter that self, right? So, in a lot of ways, dealing with politics is part of that. You know, got to deal with the other, with the fellow man. You remember we talked about Gurdjieff, and he had his group, and there was the one guy that just pissed everybody off. And when he was gone, they drove him away, and Gurdjieff went and paid him money at the train station to get him to come back because he represented that dialogue with other, right? And that's really what we got. Where we kind of started here was, what about that dialogue with other, and how do we make other, how do we transcend that otherness? And then we're all on the same team. I do think that's where we're going with this. Because all those negative things about team versus team disappear when we're all on the same team, right? When we can make suffering the other team, when we can make ignorance the other team, when we can make all of those things the other team, but us living creatures can all be on the same team. I do think that's this omega point, or this eschaton,
Mhm.
just from experiences that I've had. And this our thingness brain, the brain of agency, seems to be overdeveloped by some analysis. And that part brain is maybe the part that we're getting online and kind of in the process of evolving that connection somehow. And politics is a part of that. And just because things are rancorous, I think that more people are actually maybe involved than were in the past. And maybe we're processing something. Processing is messy. Processing is going into all the ugly details and working them out. And there's just no way around the grittiness of that. So maybe this is all part of it. And
Mm.
you know, because I know there's a lot of gnashing of teeth, but gnashing of teeth means that there's been a big, strong encounter with the other. And I see that on both sides. There's such a heavy narrative on both sides. When we started doing the New Village Alliance, I was sort of like, I knew it intellectually, but I had this aha experience when I had very, very liberal people really, really caring about these little kids. And then I had very, very conservative, I think conservative Christian people that, maybe you wouldn't even get these two groups of people to sit comfortably in the same room together, but they also really, really cared about these kids. So even there, that same teamness potential was there. And I think that whenever this is the yin and yang of it, whenever we're having that encounter with the other, we can be almost certain that there is some sameness underneath there that's charging this up, or that's giving it a carrier wave for that to move on somehow. So it's a way of saying that there's the more charged it is, the more potential there is for transformation. Once we kind of put that program in our head a little bit. So that's
Yeah.
kind of my big takeaway, maybe, or what I might have to share about it is, look at that all. If you see people, or if you find yourself having these strong emotions about these things, look at that. This is a moment when you can see your own consciousness, and you can kind of understand some of the dynamics of your own consciousness. And that ability to look is like a hack, right? The ability to step back and say, okay, and remember that the one whose heart rate is the lowest is the one that has the most power. So, there's something there. There's really good territory for mindfulness about this all. I guess that's where I'd go with that.
Yeah. Good. Um, well, I mean, I think this could be a stopping point. Obviously,
Mhm.
we could talk about the election and everything it means for hours. Is there anything you want to leave us with?
Well, the degree of newness and where do we go from here? And where do the Dems go from here? To where do the Republicans go from here? Where do the Americans go from here? There's a lot of things in the air. Yeah.
Yeah. Where does the UN go from here? Where does NATO go from here?
Where do the
There's
BRICS go from here?
Yeah, yeah. Good.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, we'll leave it there. Good luck with the snow and staying warm. I hope you're well provisioned for a couple days. And
Yeah, we're stocked up.
yeah, good. You're a pro at this.
Yep.
You even have power. So hey,
I swept off my styling solar panels and yeah, we're rocking and rolling. So
awesome. Thank you, Brian.
we'll see you next time, folks.